morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives us great pleasure to welcome you all to the third day of the World Association for Sustainable Development 15th International Annual Conference, hosted by Ahlia University under the patronage of His Royal Highness, Prince Khalifa bin Salman Al-Khalifa, the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Bahrain. The theme of this year's conference is Digital Revolution, Smart Cities and Performance improvement towards a sustainable, knowledge-based, inclusive development. And now, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Bakr Ahmed Hassan, the chair of our first session, to give a few words on this occasion.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I hope you had a great time last night with the tour and with the gala dinner. We discovered some talent in dancing, by the way, that we're going to tap on later on. Well, welcome to the first session of the last day of this really highly beneficial and enjoyable conference. Yeah. I'd like to thank you all for coming. We have a very rich program for you before, as we have 3 distinguished keynote speakers with us who will share with us their knowledge. And just, we would not like to keep your time more until the others start coming from their sleep after last night. Maybe Huda will introduce the first speaker.
I would like to invite our first speaker, Professor RONALD McQuaid, who will be giving a talk titled Graduate Employability in a Changing World. Professor RONALD, please take the stage.
Okay, thank you, Huda. May I just give you a few words about Professor RONALD McQuaid? He just told me how to say it, so I hope I pass the test. Okay. Professor McQuaid will speak on graduate employability in a challenging world. Professor McQuaid is a professor of work and employment at the University of Stirling. That I almost failed that one. He got his BS from Lancaster University, his MSc from London School of Economics, his PhD from Harvard University. His research interests include employment and employability, the effects of aging population on labor market, entrepreneurship, and economic development, and many other related fields. He has written more than 100 academic papers on the above subjects. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor RONALD McQuaid.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I want to talk about graduate employability today, but it's actually quite an old concept. Generally, employability has been a crucial part of labour market policy for at least since the 1990s. Okay. For instance, many international organisations around 1990s and 2000, the European Union, OECD, ILO and UN all brought out employability strategies or policy documents. But graduate employability, then moving it on to graduates, has become really a major objective of universities and educational bodies since about the last decade or so. For instance, in the UK, we've had various funding bodies like the Higher Education Funding Council, the key performance indicators of universities have all included employability as a key outcome of graduates. And in fact, universities now seem to be more than just going to university to get a degree. It's about going to university and getting a whole package of things, such as a degree and better access to jobs or better ability to get a job. But employability is still a very fuzzy concept. It started about 1900, over 100 years ago. Employability was really seen as a dichotomy. You're either employable, you were fit to work, or you're unemployable. Just those 2 choices. And if you're unemployable, then you can get welfare payments, you're part of the deserving poor, etc. But then, in the middle of the last century, it moved on slightly, and in places like the US and parts of Europe, US and parts of Europe, we started referring to employability as the distance between where somebody was, so somebody who has a disability, a mental or a physical disability, and what's needed to do a particular job. And that gap was sort of seen as the employability gap. There were some other views of employability in France elsewhere. But since about 1990s, the concepts moved on to being about labor market performance. So are you ready for the labor market? And this has really been split into two types of employability. An initiative employability, which says, does the individual have the initiative, have the skills, etc., to actually get into employment? And also an interactive employability, which says that, well, employability is not just about the individual. It's about the availability of jobs, the circumstances in which people are actually trying to adapt to in order to get a job. So there's many definitions of employability, graduate employability particularly. And one definition, which is fairly useful, is Mance York, who argued that employability was a set of achievements, a set of skills, understanding, personal attributes that make graduates more likely to gain employment and to be successful in their chosen field. And that this will benefit both the individuals themselves, but also society, the wider workforce, and the economy. So some components of this definition which are interesting to look at are, first of all, it's about the probability. It's not about getting into employment, but only the probability of getting into employment or improving it. But it's about gaining employment, but also maintaining employment, staying in work, and attaining new employment later on in your life. So it's not just about entry, a graduate entering a job. It's about their whole career throughout their lifespan. So, just looking at some of these sets of attributes that are commonly brought out by university policy documents and other places. Many of the attributes they give to graduate employability, we've got to train up graduates to be autonomous, independent, and self-confident. They should be globally and culturally aware, so they accept diversity very easily. They have integrity. There's a moral dimension to it as well, because people should have integrity, and we should be inculcating that in a university. There should be curiosity and the ability to learn so that they can be adaptable throughout their life and their career. Problem solving, the ability to think creatively and critically are also key components. And moving on to more of the digital revolution, and the digital implications are the ability to communicate, both verbally but also through electronically, etc., and to network, and being digitally and IT literate. And finally, there's some enterprise skills, often based on Peter Drucker's work, which sees entrepreneurship as a form of behavior, which somebody who sees opportunities can systematically look for opportunities and then actually act on them. Because I think a lot of academics like myself, maybe we can see some opportunities, but we don't necessarily act on them. So what they say on employability is about also inculcating the desire and ability to act. Then there are also the hard skills that you learn in any discipline, the technical skills, the scholarship related to a discipline. And another component, final component of employability is work experience. But it does seem that more work experience is correlated with higher employment, a higher chance of getting employment. But this list is endless. It's just, every university can add to this list or detract from this list. And these are lists of individually focused attributes and skills. But employability, a student with employability doesn't necessarily guarantee actual employment. It only influences the chances of you getting that employment. So in addition to these views that are focused mainly on the skills and attributes of undergraduates, as I say, these are particularly common among university strategies and practitioners, partly because, A, they deal with the individual, and secondly, what can they influence? They cannot influence these other factors that maybe affect somebody's getting into work, such as labor demand or whatever, so they focus on what they can actually influence, and then they call that employability. However, there are other ways of looking at employability which actually to focus on what factors actually influence outcomes. So it's not just what the individual does, it's also about the opportunities out there. Some of the social relationships that will influence whether somebody gets employment, what is the demand, etc. I'm just, in the next slide, I'll cover a couple of these issues. So taking a broader view of employability, you've got the individual skills and attributes that the universities tend to focus on, but there are other issues like health and well-being. You know, what are the health factors that can restrict somebody's ability to enter employment? Do they have the job-seeking skills, the adaptability and mobility? Can they adapt to go into other sectors? Even there may be influence of parents, which says, oh, you shouldn't be working into the theatre industry. That's not a good industry, because I don't know anything about it. So a lot of parents influence their children to stick to what they know, and therefore reduces the number of opportunities that the young person can have. You've got personal circumstances, which are maybe childcare, household circumstances. You've got childcare or looking after parents, etc. You've got work or educational culture, and again, this goes back to the parents actually influencing the child, saying, don't move into that sector, don't move into another sector. You've got access to resources, which may be, you know, have you got relatives who can help you to get introductions to certain employment opportunities? Do you have enough money, financial resources to do an internship? Huge debate in the UK now is actually trying to stop unpaid interns, because the only people who can do unpaid internships are people with relatively large amounts of money. So if an internship is an entry into a job, and when you interview people, you say, these people have had an internship, therefore we should be employing them first. What you're really doing is saying, well, people who've got enough money to be able to afford to work for 6 months for nothing should be getting the job, and other people who cannot afford it and had to work don't get that job. So there's a huge equity issue of using interns, and that's quite a big issue in the UK at the moment. But these access to resources influence your ability to get into work. But also there are external factors, particularly demand factors. So is somebody employable? If there's a very tight labour market, not many people applying for a job, an employer might say, yes, we will employ this person, they're employable. However, if there are many, many unemployed graduates, etc., lots of people applying for the job, an employer may say, well, I want somebody to make the tea, so instead of getting a graduate to do that, I want a PhD to do that. So they just set the bar much higher. Now the people have not changed, but the employers change what they expect simply because of the state of the labour market. So in a way, you cannot think of employability purely in the abstract. Whether somebody can get access to a job and is considered employable does depend on the state of the labour market and the views of the employer. The last group of things I wanted to briefly talk about today were some of these external things. What actually influences the future employability of a young graduate? It seems to be quite tough nowadays, although to be honest, it was very tough in the 1980s, I think even tougher than it is now for many young people. So what are the factors maybe are influencing the future of young graduates and their employability? So I'm going to look at three things. So the first one is a bit about the demographics. That'll be the longest just because it takes longer to explain. Then looking a little bit about artificial intelligence very briefly, and then really about how people learn. So taking the first one, the longest one, which is about demographics. You've got a very common picture here. This is Scotland. And partly because I'm from Scotland, so we're using this. But it does illustrate a point. So here's 1911, the traditional population pyramid. So you'll see these are the males, these are the females. And you'll see most people are very, very young. Not to 14, huge numbers. Up the number of graduates, this number of people are graduates, say 20-year-olds. The number of old people, very small. And here's 1951. Oh, strange, we've got the beginning of the baby boom down here, and the effect of the war, so much straighter. Fast forward to 2000, and we've got a supertanker. So there's the ship, the supertanker with very few young people, lots of baby boomers coming up here, and there's the graduates. However, look at 2031, which is only another, 14 years from now, and we've got the coffin. And this is the baby boomers are now retired, but look at the number of graduates. Very, very small number. Now, the bottom scale of all these diagrams is the same. So this is the number of young people, 2031. Compare that to the number of young males in 1911. Massive changes in the demographics we're all very aware of. But it does mean that there's going to be a great, relatively shortfall of young people increasingly. If you look at other countries like China, same thing. China in 2010 is the blue and the red. The red is females, blue is males. So you can see here the number of graduates, 2010. Here's the number of 20-year-olds. Fast forward 13 years from now to 2030. Look at that, far, far fewer graduates. Far, far more people experienced in the labor market. So there are fundamental changes in the population structure, and these will greatly affect graduates. And it's not just the population structure that basically the whole world is aging, except aging in structure, except actually Central and West Asia, where we are now, and Sub-Saharan Africa. But just to give you some idea of the scale, here's Europe. This is the total number of people of working age, 15 to 64. So you can see we're already past the peak of the number of working age population. Now, the working age actual number of people in the labor market does change, because particularly the number of females in the labor market. But in Europe, the number of females in Northern Europe is almost very similar to male. And so there's not much scope of it for increasing. Not much scope for increasing the size of the labor force through increased female participation. But in Europe, you can see we're already on the downward spiral in terms of total population of working age. And the projections are that there will be a shortfall of about 42 million in the next 50 years if we have high levels of in-migration, and about 96 million workers shortfall compared to today if we don't have migration. So it just shows you a little bit of the scale. But it's happening throughout the world. Here's China, or East Asia. 1.1 billion people. But we're just hitting the peak of the number of people of this working age. As I said, it will change by some people working older, for longer when they're older, more female participation rates, etc. So this isn't exactly the labor market size, but it just gives you an order of the direction in which we're heading. And this is in some ways good news for graduates, because there's going to be relative shortage of graduates and more opportunities. The one of the places that is different is actually where we are now. So if you look at West Asia, which includes Bahrain, Iraq, Turkey, Egypt, etc., you can see that the population here is growing. But my argument would be the numbers here are quite small. 1.1 billion in Eastern Asia. This is 150, 160 million, very small in a global scale. Very important locally. But the opportunities for graduates from here are likely to be in Europe, North America, South America, even East Asia, in terms of all these places are looking for young people. So Bahrain won't be in isolation. There will be opportunities for the young Bahrainis elsewhere. So that's just the population demographics. So in some ways it's things that may be bad for undergraduates, but the future trend is actually probably that things may become quite good for graduates in the not too distant future, other things being equal. But of course, other things are not necessarily equal. We've got artificial intelligence, as we've heard in many of the talks here. The projections for massive job cuts, possibly due to artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc. And 47% of US employments are at risk, according to Prey and Osborne, quite a well-known study of a couple of years ago. And they looked at the characteristics of jobs and said which ones are easy to change. The least likely to be replaced by artificial intelligence are ones that have to take very bespoke skills. So an emergency management director, nobody knows what emergency is. You can't program a computer easily into saying, it will be this type of emergency or that, because by its nature, things will change. So very difficult to automate. Same with occupational therapist, which is at the other end. Occupational therapy has been around for centuries. It's about people going into an old person's house and saying how we can adjust your chairs so you can get out of chairs more easily or out of bed more easily. What type of knives and forks should you have? Sounds very basic, but the thing is that every single person that occupational therapist goes to is a totally bespoke solution. So it's very difficult to computerize because every individual has different psychological and physical characteristics, and therefore whoever responds to that has to be aware of all of these things. Very difficult to get an AI, artificial intelligence, to automate that. So there will be some of these jobs that are at threat from high level and some at low levels. The jobs that are most likely to be got rid of are telemarketers and tax preparers, because the tax laws are fairly clear. Put that into a program and that's your answer. But there will be others, like certain diagnostic factors of doctors, lawyers, etc., will be heavily influenced. Using the same methodology, they've reckoned that 35% of UK jobs could be automated within 20 years, although in some places like London, probably 30%, some industries much more affected. Now these are all, in a way, guesstimates, of course, but and the reality won't necessarily reflect these figures. But it does give an indication of with machine learning accelerating potentially at exponential rates, we could have a major impact on society. And driverless cars, we talked about yesterday, 5 million truck drivers in America could be affected. Now, this could lead to mass employment, but I think this is probably unlikely given the history of the world. And it also depends on distribution policies. Does the government have enough money to be able to hire people to be more occupational therapists or social care workers? So will they get enough revenue to be able to do that? Another solution could be low income. However, alternatively, it could be that there will be new jobs that we haven't even thought about, new industries and new sectors. So in 1890, if you were looking after horses, horses have been around for millennia, 2,000 years with horses. They're main means of transport. There are stables everywhere. We need lots of people to feed the horses, to look after them, because they're the main means of transport. 1890, it's been a job for 2,000 years. It'll be there forever. Well, it wasn't. They say that the problem was in New York. In New York, the horse droppings were going to be up to a foot, and the whole city is going to be covered with horse droppings if the rate of horses increases at the rate it had been increasing. What happened 20 years later? The whole motor industry, jobs that nobody had even heard of, came into existence. So there may be a lot of new jobs, but we don't know what these are. We don't know what employability skills will be needed for these, other than issues like creative intelligence, also social intelligence of working with other people, and physical dexterity, where it's quite difficult to get computers to replace us. So these are some of the issues that we really don't know, but how do you actually arrange graduate employability in order to meet these future unknown needs? And the very last point, which I'll just very briefly cover, is each generation is defined by its life experiences. It gives different attitudes, beliefs, sensitivities. But it also means that the people now trying to create employability for people came from a different era. And we are not really fully aware what the younger generations, how they think, how they develop, and how they learn. There's a wonderful web on YouTube, I should say, where you've a 1-year-old child, and it's got an iPad, and it pushes the iPad, giggling, smiling away, and a wonderful iPad. Then the parent gives it a magazine, a glossy magazine, and the child goes to the glossy magazine and pulls it down and says, "It's not working. Why isn't the magazine? Why isn't the picture moving?" And then it pushes the finger into its finger. "No, my finger's working. It's not my finger that's broken. The magazine is a broken iPad. It doesn't move." So what's happened, as the saying goes, is that Steve Jobs in Apple has managed to reprogram that child. The child now thinks of a glossy picture, as something other than what I thought when I was young. So there's a lot of reprogramming of minds in a way that we aren't fully aware. So some employers will say, well, no, we want graduates who can fit into the way we've always done things. But other employers will actually be ahead of us, and they'll be looking for graduates that we aren't even aware of what the needs are. So I think there's a lot of change that universities will have to make, but I would say the university has been around for many years. It's changed over time. We had an industrial revolution. We had medieval universities, and we had an industrial revolution with the new universities like in UK, Manchester's, etc., which were more scientific, more technical universities. So universities do change. It just takes time for them to adapt. So in conclusion, there are many narrow versions of employability, and they focus on skills and attributes of graduates. But that's because the institutions are looking more at what they can change rather than what is actually needed for the graduate. The graduates are entering an uncertain world with occupation and industries that we don't even know that don't even exist today. So the digital revolution will impact graduate employability by leading to changes in what employability actually means, how universities and others support it throughout life, not just at the beginning. So again, universities probably, the skills will not be just, you take an 18-year-old and they come out a 21-year-old. It'll be like MIT 25, 30 years ago. At MIT, what they did was they said, any engineer who qualified 10 years ago knows nothing about engineering except the tiny little specialty they're in today. And same for every professional. So they had refreshment courses say, you graduated 20 years, you've now been doing this tiny little bit of electronic engineering which you're expert at, but you don't know what else has happened in the field, so you come back for a 2-week course to refresh the broad view of engineering. So I think the way universities treat alumni, it won't be just as a source of money to get, but there'll be a source of how do we continue lifelong learning at a high level. And finally, teaching must go beyond employability though, because universities should deal with wider societal issues and the need to develop graduates both in a moral and critical thinking throughout their lives. So we shouldn't just be thinking employability is the main purpose of the university. It's only a small component of what we need to do. So thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much. It's an interesting, of course, to talk about employment, and I want to make reference to this part of the world. You read what the World Bank and the United Nations are trying to suggest that by 2030 we need to create 100 million jobs in this part of the world, in the Arab world. And this is probably one of the greatest challenges that's facing this part of the world or these countries. Now, if you look closely at employment, they always tell you that almost 70% of employment in the public sector. Now we are talking about employability, and we are talking about university graduate with highly skilled. Most of those who graduate from universities probably, they don't fit into the government sector, which are most of the people who are employed here in this part of the world. Now, the other things, when we speak about the developing countries, because this employability has become just like fashion. Everybody is talking about, and I'm not being able to understand what is really they are talking about. Employability of a graduate, the question, are universities responsible for finding jobs for students? That's not their job, basically. You are training students. And most of the skills that we are talking about today are highly skilled, only fit within certain sectors. Within certain sectors in the society. And here I'm talking about the developing countries, where the majority of the people, they live in rural areas. And most of the skills that you mentioned may not necessarily be of benefit to these countries.
Right. I think much of what you said, I think is very, very sensible. I mean, I think maybe my last point was that the role of the university is not about just increasing employability. I think a lot of what is counted as employability is really training, which is not the role of the university. I think the role of the university is education and for the lifelong thinking skills of the student. I think that's absolutely fundamental, and I totally agree on that. I would say that looking more at the developed countries, a lot of it's come out of employers saying we don't have graduates who are meeting our needs. One answer to that, though, is actually, well, maybe the employers have to do a lot more induction, a lot more training themselves, and they shouldn't be expecting somebody to come out and know meet their needs exactly. Because they've got very short-term needs, and what education is about is lifelong. So it's not teaching you how to use the latest package of Word on Microsoft. That's training. It's about using the idea of being able to express yourself in written ways, using programs, etc., is more about education. So I think that there's a danger of employability having too much influence on education. However, we must also make sure that we help students to adapt to a future of change. And this is where creative thinking, I think, is very, very important. I would also mention about enterprise, because you said most of the jobs in the developed world are in the public sector. So part of employability is actually about making people more enterprising in a way, looking at opportunities and thinking about where job opportunities outside of the public sector may be. But I would be very careful about this, because in Scotland they had a development agency said, okay, we want to make students more enterprising, so we're going to fund every university in Scotland to include enterprise skills in every module of every course in Scotland. And what they did was they came along and said, right, here's all the money to the university, let's do it. You must include enterprise skills. And we got someone who's teaching ancient Greek history. And they would say, we were in staff rooms, and you'd say, what is enterprise skill in ancient Greek history? Is it about people who set up shops in Greece? What is it all about? And nobody knew what they meant by enterprise skills. And the whole program was a disaster, because they didn't explain what they meant by enterprise skills. And then maybe several months later, they eventually said, oh, it's about presentation skills and group working and all these. But they hadn't defined that at the beginning. So they lost all support of their staff. They caused confusion, and it was a total disaster. So I think when people do start trying to influence a particular aspect of employability, it can also backfire and have a very negative effects. But okay, sorry.
Yeah, I just want your comment. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor McQuaid. I cannot reconcile, just following on what Professor Amr and yourself said, I cannot reconcile employability with the universities, with entrepreneurship, with the demand and the politics of the whole situation. Now you say there will be opportunities for young people in the West and Southeast Asia from this area of the world because of the birth rate and the demographics. Yet, the political situation and all the demand as well, not only how to, we try to do the same things as Western universities and Eastern universities, yet our model that we have in these countries is just totally different. The way government operates is totally different. The funding for universities is really non-existing for private universities, if you like. So how do we reconcile all of this? How can we follow the same model, yet our infrastructure for all of that is not the same?
Yes. Well, very briefly, I don't think I'd be able to even answer that if I had a long time to speak. But I do think that you're quite right in that we really have to adopt the suitable model for your local circumstances. So I think that's absolutely crucial, that you take bits of other models, but you do have to adapt them to your own circumstances. What I would say is that there's a wider, the effect I was saying about the graduate opportunities is your graduates will have wider opportunities beyond the region here, partly because of these demographic changes and technological changes. And that will affect you no matter what you do, because young people will be, assuming that we continue a world where people can move around more. But I would say it's going to be extremely difficult to reconcile all these employability and enterprise, etc. But really what we're trying to do is prepare young people for a better life is one thing. But also, I think the role of the university is more and more into the lifelong learning, where we're going to have to help people adapt at later ages, rather than the old historical one, which is 17 to 21 or something. Really, we do have to increase lifelong learning and let people adapt throughout time.
Okay, we have just only one.
I can.
Yeah, I have very short question. I just would like to know the role of entrepreneurship education and training on creating employment opportunity and in supplying students with the required skills for employability. Thanks. The role of entrepreneurship education and training.
Yeah, I think we've got to distinguish between education and training to a large degree. I mean, there is some overlap, but I do think that the education is for long-term life. It's also about attitudes of systematically looking for opportunities, and the attitude is how do I identify, how do I analyze opportunities, and that is something that needs to be inbred with students. So they're curious, they actually look for things in a different way, and they feel comfortable with that. Same as they feel comfortable with diversity, with different types of people, etc. So the more they are comfortable with a changing environment, then the more they will be able to act as entrepreneurs in entrepreneurship.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Professor Abdallah Al-Hawaj, Professor Mansour Al-Ali, and Professor Alam Ahmed to please come on stage to reward our speakers with certificates of appreciation. Professor Ronald McCaid.